Hi, I'm Tim O'Reilly, the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media, and I'm here with Dave Campbell, who's a technical fellow at Microsoft working in the database area. I met Dave last year in a meeting where I was getting some briefing on some future initiatives at Microsoft in that area, and I was just so excited to hear how he was thinking, because I watch technology from the cheap seats, and I'm kind of doing pattern recognition from a distance, and I've been talking for years about data as operating system. And then Dave starts talking and I go, oh, here's a guy who's actually making what I've been talking about. So I really wanted to have Dave talk a little bit about the work that he's been doing and the group he's in has been doing, because it seems to me like a group that really gets it. So maybe Dave, maybe you can tell us, just start from the top of what it is you're doing.
Sure. I mean, Tim, I've been doing sort of data and database stuff for 25 years or so. And I always take a look at where's the value moving to. And it occurred to me over the last 3 to 5 years that the value is moving to the data itself and our ability to recombine it. How do we refine it? How do we combine it in different ways? And just see people sort of turn things inside out, from having data be locked behind applications to be front and center.
Yeah. Well, it seemed to me, I mean, it was interesting when I wrote my What is Web 2.0 paper, the piece that I think most people overlooked at first was the line, data is the new Intel inside. You know, the notion that you had these massive data subsystems that were effectively being assembled into a kind of operating system. You know, you think about location, identity, and so on, and you can start to see that. And you know, when I first started talking about it, everybody thought I was nuts. But you know, now of course you walk around with a phone and you realize, well, exactly what is the operating system of some of those apps that you're using on your phone? It's somewhere in the cloud. There's a big database subsystem driving, you know, your location, your identity, your communications. So, but the idea that it's an operating system is a bit far-fetched at first. But it seems to me that using it as an analogy, you do start to think interestingly about the future.
Sure.
So can you tell us a little bit about you know, what your thoughts are on that?
Well, in terms of an analogy, I think one good thing, if you go back, you think about before we had printer drivers all aligned behind a particular service abstraction.
Yeah.
Every application came with its own printer drivers and whatnot.
That's right.
And then the operating system provided that as a facility. You think about location. For the last 10 years or so, every application's done its location. But you can imagine location services now becoming part of this data operating system. Reference data becoming part of this data operating system. So service abstractions that everyone can then build upon, I think, are a key part of it, and a good analogy.
It seems to me also, though, as we look at you know, those kinds of data services, there's the first generation, which is just, you know, where are you? You know? But you start thinking about higher level services where you'd say, oh, okay, you know, say traffic. You know, we're actually going to reroute you dynamically based on traffic, rather than we're going to, you know, and the fact is we're going to know about traffic because we're getting lots of data from connected cell phones and so on and so forth. And so in real time, we'll have a feedback loop. So you can imagine the data subsystem, even something that seems really fairly well developed now, becoming much more sophisticated, much more useful to application developers.
Absolutely. I mean, it started with reference data, what sorts of things static, and then sort of what sort of feeds, dynamic feeds. But the thing you just touched on in terms of planning and routing, more and more things going to online algorithms. So one example I've been using lately in this space, which kind of I think is interesting, is imagine there are a bunch of people at a game, 20,000 people going to drive away. If you can see across all of that, you don't want to pick the same optimal route for everybody and send all 20,000 to the same place. So the ability to aggregate across, both in terms of observation and then in terms of planning, I think is really interesting.
I've never thought about that. That is really interesting. Actually, I was just reading something about you know, kind of the French system of railroads, where they had the central plan version and everything radiated from Paris, and they thought this was much better than the hodgepodge that everybody had before. But it turned out in World War II that they had all these bottlenecks, and it's kind of interesting because that kind of the internet architecture again, you know, that we kind of want flooding routing.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
Very interesting. Swarming for the win. So, but practically, how are you thinking about this for developers, and where are you in this process of thinking this through?
So, things are changing for developers, and how do we make these available as services? And I think a good way I walk through with customers is to talk about the progression from when we first had information technology applications, and the data was behind the application. And the first class of higher level services, reporting, analytics, and such, they were behind the application as well. But you go 10, 15 years ago, the database vendors started to provide reporting, they started to provide synchronization, replication, other sorts of services. So that's sort of the first generation, sort of the machinery of the data. And then the next generation, how do we reason about the data itself? And that's sort of the evolution and the progression, and just walking people through that. So for developers, the ability to basically discover, combine, and refine data into new forms. And if you go look at most of the compelling new apps, they have some element of just connecting to something. It's about context, and how do we incorporate various forms of context to produce great experiences.
So when we think about context, there are a lot of ways to frame things. You can think of context by type of device. You can think of context by type of market. You can also think of context, as a set of things like location, social, time, even things like, weather, or, kind of like weather. I've been really fascinated lately by the notion of using accelerometer data as a key to thinking a lot about getting context for the user. Like, are they in the same place or are they moving? Adjusting apps. There's all kinds of new data streams that we can start to use to key off of and say, wait, let's think differently about the user experience. But there's also sort of market context. So when I think about this notion of data as operating system, you can think about it one way if you're talking about, say, well, what are we doing to support mobile apps? And you think of it a different way if you're saying, well, what are we doing to support retailers and their supply chains, or or manufacturers in their supply chains, or how are we thinking about it for healthcare? So I guess the question is, how are you guys thinking about it? I mean, what are some of those areas that you're kind of trying to build a next-gen infrastructure for?
So lots of interesting thoughts there. I mean, with respect to the context itself, you started and I started thinking about dimensionalizing it. I gave a talk to some friends at Microsoft Research a couple of years ago. They call it contextual computing. And I started by just breaking down sort of the base dimensions around location, around various sorts of things, time. So I think time and space become very interesting sort of primitive types in this new world. And then above that, how do you do what I've been calling information production to get things of a different form? So how do I use the accelerometer in my phone to determine whether I'm jogging, whether I'm sitting or not? I've been carrying around a GPS data logger for a year or so, and I compute when I'm home or when I'm at work. And then I combine that with when I send email, and I can, how much mail do I send when I'm home or work? If my wife is watching this, I haven't shown her that one yet. But, so that's the next step up.
No, it's really a really good point. It's sort of like the production of synthetic data. It really comes from some combination. Why do you have to work at the lowest level? And it changes UI. I mean, the example I got from Sam Liang at Aloha Mobile was, why does Runkeeper, require you to tell the app when you started running and when you stopped, when your phone already knows that.
Exactly.
And it's sort of interesting. You just think differently about the affordances that we get from sensors, for example, today.
And the ability to do this interesting transformation from one information domain to another, go from the accelerometer to my activities.
That's right.
Different classes and events and states.
You can start to identify. And again, that kind of it brings us back to that operating system notion, because it's about higher levels of abstraction, which allow developers to be more efficient because somebody's figured out a bunch of plumbing. But I want to come back to this notion of sort of business domains and contexts. So like if you look at it, and this is from maybe horse race kind of handicapping, you're going to say, okay, so here's Google with their mobile stack, behind Android and their app space and their effectively their data OS. You've got Apple building theirs, and you've got Microsoft and Nokia partnering on another one. That are not interoperable. And it's easy to kind of see that as the main horse race. And it's certainly a pretty big one today. But it also seems to me there are a whole lot of other areas that are in play. And they're right now where Microsoft is much stronger, in, say, business computing. And so could we think about that for a bit. Like, what kinds of things are people doing with data in business that's changing the fundamental nature of business applications?
Actually, this one I haven't shared with you before, I don't think. I start many of my big data talks from experience I had with some folks at a large commercial airline a couple of years ago. And we're enterprise architects. We were chatting about, sort of the plight of the airline industry. And we were talking about transactional systems. And all of a sudden, one of the architects puts his head in his hands and he said, our business is horrible. We're just killing each other. Everyone wants just the lowest price. And he paused and he said, we've come to realize that the only way we're going to survive is to do a better job of yield management, a better job of fuel management, and a better job of selling ancillary things to our customers than our competitors. And he said, that all requires us to do new things with data that we don't know how to do today.
Yeah.
So if you think about where are they going to get the pricing information for fuel futures? Where are they going to determine, hey, there's a big storm coming.
That's right.
What do we do with the fleet? So this whole
right.
notion, and for many of these businesses, it's becoming sort of the difference between success or not. Digital commerce, optimization there. So we're doing some work with the CRM team to say, how do we take the various social feeds that we have, say, in Bing, and turn it into sentiment scoring so that I have a set of terms that I'm interested in and I can follow. And a lot of things, a lot of applicability to business. And the conversation that I've had in the big data space in 2 years with a lot of the CIOs has just been fascinating how much it shifted. 18 to 24 months ago, they were, what is this big data thing and do I have to worry about it? And the last 6 to 9 months, 3 out of 4 of the conversations are, hey, I know I need to get going here. How do I do it?
Well, the thing that I found interesting in our conversation last year was you started talking about, for example, opening up APIs to developers to some of these services. So can you kind of give us a rundown of some of what's available?
Yeah. And so we've got this thing we call the data market, which a couple of folks and myself kind of pushed for a few years ago. And it wraps back around to your question that what are the conditions in which this thing's really going to take off? How do we take friction out of certain things and have the content be compelling enough? So we have a lot of reference data now. There's a lot of government data and open data mandates and such. So we're trying to facilitate some things there.
By the way, I just want to interrupt there. One of the things that in government space I've been trying to encourage government people to do is not just consume data from outside services more effectively, but also to be a better provider. And there's a fundamental shift when you start thinking about this data as platform to figuring out, well, who's already got the users? And so a good example of that, when I was working with Todd Park when he was CTO at HHS, there's this HHS hospital compare data set they've been accumulating for years, quality, survey data, so on. And I was like, well, how many people go to the HHS website and find this? Why don't you see if we can reach out to people at Google and Microsoft to use it in the search engine? And I was really excited to have Microsoft take us up on that. And so it now helps power, the hospital and nursing home search in Bing. And I think that's kind of part of the thinking of the future, not just for everybody to start saying, well, here's my unique data that I have. How can I make it available to other developers? And how can I get it in front of more users rather than, I'm going to build my own app, my own site. It's the old portal thinking recreated in app space.
Exactly.
It's like, sometimes just coming up with a great data format. GTFS, great example. Once you got a few cities going on it, it becomes sort of fuel for everybody to up the level, and that's what I want to see happen.
Well, it's interesting. So much of this, I think, is about taking friction out of the system in the large. And I think an example you and I have both used is this notion of zip codes. How often do we have to go and you give someone both zip code, city, and state?
I know.
It's crazy, right?
Exactly.
But it just speaks to the friction. Because there's an authority who owns the data. It's public data. They clean it. But it's just the distribution friction that causes
it's just
all
not
things.
really there. Actually, I remember thinking you kind of want to be able to join to some set of tables in the cloud.
And that's part of the vision to make it really easy for developers to discover that, just to be able to incorporate it in the app. And so we've been doing some things. It's great to get on sort of this learning cycle. We did some work to make it easy to consume in a bunch of apps, and we realized there are a whole bunch of data sets that get updated periodically. So zip codes are a great example. They don't change all that often. What's really the low overhead protocol for me to go and figure out if anything's changed and incorporate in the app?
So. But kind of going back, I took you off I asked you a question and I got excited and I took you off so you were starting to talk about the data market and what kind of stuff is in there.
So we've got in there, as I started, the reference data, other forms. Well, it's beyond data. The other thing I think that is sort of the next step up are models and services. And at some point maybe we'll start talking about data scientists and whatnot. But who are these rare people who can take this data and turn it into other valuable information? And
concrete, more concrete. Give me some examples of.
So there's frankly, one of the services that's being most used right now is this Bing translation service. So by using statistical machine learning over the corpus that we have, we produced a translation service that allows you to translate from one language to another.
Right.
And so that's one of the services. With respect to the data, much of the public data there's a lot of really interesting public data sets that we have up there, so people consuming them. So there's open protocol we call OData, which are extensions to Atom and AtomPub. So.
Yeah, so that kind of brings up this notion of services. If you look at the competitive landscape, how do you handicap yourself against other big data players at actually providing these things as information services for developers?
We can spend a lot of time on that. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and
how can we get better at that, I guess,
it's
as opposed to, you can adopt my stack and then it works.
Well, here's the thing. In order to do the things people want to do, they're going to need to pull it from everywhere and turn it into what they want, right? Yeah. And so what form of value can we provide to people on our platform? I mean, the data itself as the computational platform, such that they can turn it into something interesting. You can also imagine us just having sanctioned feeds, because there are people going out and scraping other and they have data scientists trying to shut off the guys who are scraping them. So, if we had a way to have a real market take place there, I think that's the thing. And then at the end of the day, so much of this, it's about action and insight. Right? So how do I drive an app and have great action? And how do I let people just, derive their own insights? And so if you think about, so many people, it's the tools, right? Yeah. How do you get it in the BI stack? How do people sit in front of Excel?
So you're kind of imagining something like an app store for data feeds, where you actually,
and services,
and people can actually pay, and and there's actually competition to say, I have a better, service of this kind than someone else.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I've been talking to this guy who's got a machine learning startup for about close to a year. And they've done some interesting models around what we call Salesforce optimization. It's like lead re-ranking and whatnot. And the signals that they get, again, they're one of the folks trying to scrape stuff from various places. Imagine those feeds were just available in a commercial sense in the platform. And then we've got a place where you can run the computation and then a route to market. Yeah. So instead of finding the next 1,000 customers, they can just kind of go here and subscribe to this module. And the people building things together at that level. So
that's I can really see that would be quite useful.
Yeah, and for the people who can get to see that story, it's pretty compelling.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about sensors and how they're changing the game.
Yeah.
It used to be that data was, stuff that people typed in on keyboards. And actually, people used to ask me, what's Web 3? And I would say, well, it wasn't a version number, but it was just about the second coming of the .com, after the .com bust, the second coming of the web. But if it was a version number, it would be when these data services started being created by sensors rather than people typing on keyboards. And now that's pretty obvious.
Yes.
But, again, I think it's really interesting and important for this audience to understand that the obvious part of that happening on mobile is not necessarily the only or most interesting part.
Absolutely.
So, like I talked to Jeff Immelt recently, and GE's been talking a bunch about the industrial internet. And what does that look like? And how can we get data from jet engines for fuel optimization? And how can we, again, nuclear plants talking to, the smart grid is all in that space. But there are a lot of other areas where you can start thinking about how sensors will change business. Parking, we serve smart parking now. You start imagining, well, that actually could feed over into the, the apps. What if your mapping app also had a parking recommendations on it? Oh, there's a parking spot around on the next street over. That's huge.
Absolutely. And people refer to it by different things, machine-born data and whatnot. And, lots of ways of making the point, but there's this thing a few years back, it was business activity monitoring, and people had to go instrument all of aspects of their applications and such. But now just being able to harvest the logs and do this information production, so many things are just emanating digital signals and events, and we can use it in various forms. So I refer to this as ambient data. It's just out there, and how do we just capture it? And here's the interesting, I get to this point where I assert to people the cost of data acquisition's gone to zero. So you mentioned people used to key it in. So 30, 40 years ago, that's pretty much how it all got there.
Yeah.
And I looked a couple years ago for a talk I was doing. You can still find people to do that here in the States. It's roughly $1 per kilobyte, okay, whether it's keypad, data entry or manuscript typing. So it's $1 per kilobyte, okay, and so it works out to be $1 billion a terabyte if you do the math, roughly. And so people aren't typing this in, and we got terabytes just coming in all over the place, and how do we turn it into value? So
that's I think where the opportunity is. And you talk about, you're talking earlier about the stack, with low-level data services, information services, and then maybe BI at the top.
Yeah.
But that information services layer seems really important because we're not really there yet. We still have a bunch of people. We don't even have data service in a lot of cases. People are kind of down there writing. It's the equivalent of in the PC day, everybody writing their own driver still. And we do need it to start being systematized.
Yes. But I think one of the biggest challenges I see as I talk, you mentioned, how do people wrap their head around this? When I talk to a lot of folks, it's unlearning, right? Where's the new value in this new space? So as an example of that, we get to a tipping point when the cost or the perceived latent value of this ambient data is greater than the cost to acquire and store it. Because you can just hang on to it and figure out how you're going to turn it into value.
Yeah.
So there's this notion of a digital shoebox, people just throwing all of these feeds and streams into one place, and then only building a model after the fact.
Yeah.
So when the data warehousing guys encounter this, it makes their head hurt.
Yeah.
And so here's a real example. I was talking to folks in the life sciences business, pharmaceutical, a bunch of drugs that are nearing the end of their patent. And so they want to go back in and look at the clinical trials to see if there are any side effects that are advantageous in which they can basically get new value out of these drugs. But all of these clinical trials over decades are in different forms and such, and just how do they pull it together in a way to make sense out of it and then turn it into value? So if you come from a traditional enterprise data warehousing space, it's incredibly hard. And there are these guys who say there's only one version of the truth. And I look at them and go, no, in this today's world, there's multiple versions of the truth. What's in your enterprise data warehouse is valuable, but there's a version of the truth out there in terms of what people are saying about your products. And there's a version of the truth that's just operational around all of your processes are emanating data. And if you're not turning that into value, you're not keeping up with the next guy.
Yeah, so that kind of brings up kind of the question in general about how businesses can get more advantage out of data. It seems to me that it's pretty clear in, say, the tech world that there's sort of network effects in data that have given enormous power to some companies. But I think across every company, there are small or large competitive advantages to be gained from data.
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. It's what I find fascinating is that you could make some claim in terms of there's only a very small fraction in terms of the real potential value people, out of data that people are unlocking. So if you go in the financial services space, fraud detection.
Yeah.
There's a case, or web commerce, some of the optimization there. People have been outsourcing that for a number of years. And now I see both in financial services and in digital commerce, people bringing things back in-house. And when I ask them why, they say, we have signals in-house we've come to realize that we can incorporate that either the third party we've been dealing with doesn't know how to incorporate, or we're not willing to share it with them. So, but this notion of they can get so much more value once they wrap their head around how to turn what they have in hand into value. That, I think, is it's sort of a mind shift I think a lot of these folks need to go through. When they do, they just find more and more of it.
That brings up kind of to me, a key point, which is how you deliver value from it is changing. It used to be that there's this sort of notion of the analyst, and the analyst kind of studies reams and reams of data and comes up with reports and recommendations. And I see increasingly the move to building in real-time feedback loops as the future. And you really look at it even in by analogy in something like mapping. You know, we start out with a paper map,
right.
and then we get our first generation online maps, and then you kind of get much more dynamic, better affordances. But the end game is cars that just know where to go.
Yeah.
And you're not even looking at the report anymore, you know, the map as the equivalent of a report, because you just say, you know, go to Joe's house, you know, and that's where we're headed.
Yeah.
And in a similar way, you know, you think about, you know, say inventory reordering. You know, the more sophisticated companies, you know, like Walmart, somebody takes something to the cash register and it, you know, it's a trigger. It's an event trigger, just like in a web app, you know, except it's triggering an event at a factory and in the supply chain versus, you know, an old school business where, you know, I remember in bookstores I used to say, look, you know, this is one of my old hobby horses. You know, shoplifting was did far more damage than piracy because you go into a bookstore, they say, oh yeah, we have it in stock. You know, and you know, it had been shoplifted a year before because they did inventory once a year, and they never reordered because hey, it didn't sell.
Nobody could find it on the shelf. Exactly, exactly.
And so that whole notion now, of course, of you know that feedback loop, you know, and people went to now we're updating because we're inventorying every
exactly.
You know,
it's so true.
You know, and the world is becoming more like web apps, and I think that's one of the things that businesses really need to learn.
Yeah, a couple things there. I mean, there's just this reduction in latency, and you can look at it through so many different lenses, and that's a key part of this. I was talking to a shipping company a couple of years ago, and what are they using their GPS for? And they really, you know, because they had GPS in the delivery vehicles, and they had a couple of things. Say, well, how about the following thing? Imagine one day you have an alert that goes off because a driver drove right across the river and got to his customer's delivery 15 minutes earlier. The next day, 4 drivers go across. Day after that, it's 17. And on day 4, you replan your routes because you realize there's a new bridge there. Are you able to, react and respond that way? Or you have to wait 6 months to get a new DVD from the GIS vendor? Right? And it's just, collapsing that is, and then when the models start to tune themselves, that's another dimension. So people here's the fascinating thing about this. People who've gotten their head, they've crossed on the other side. What I see is I look around, once they recognize the net new value, they can just find many more opportunities for it.
So when you talk about the model tuning itself, who's doing that?
It's you go up a level in terms of abstraction. So I've got several different cases where sort of dynamic models have replaced editors and product planners. And one friend shared a few years ago from digital commerce. And the homepage where they were selling stuff, there was a weekly meeting where the product planners got together and duked it out. And certain real estate was more valuable than others in the home screen. And I want the sneakers here and this way. And they moved to a genetic algorithm where they basically placed product and then measured the response. And they would just mutate every once in a while and just kind of go from there. So you think about that as one dimension, having the system tune itself in response. But then we talked earlier about these various dimensions of context. So now there's a personalization dimension as well. So knowing who we are, right, that comes into it as well. And these things start to compound.
And obviously, you think about that and then you go, oh, okay, that's what the next generation e-commerce platform looks like. It has that kind of smarts to it. It's not just sort of new, features. And it's sort of interesting because there's so much opportunity to rethink almost every business app that's out there as an intelligent learning app that closes the loop and reconfigures itself, learns from its users.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. So what about healthcare? We were talking earlier about some work you're doing there.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting, obviously a lot of efficiencies to be gained through healthcare, a lot of challenges. One of the things that we have done recently is patient readmittance. There are some changes in the healthcare system where this is going to become really important. People will be watching over this. And so collected a large volume of data that was available. It was just laying there in ambient form, if you will. And then, learned a few things in the large and learned a few things in the small. So in the large, you can say, okay, here's a course of action, 2 protocols roughly equivalent. They were perceived as equivalent. And then we realized that if someone comes in with a particular pre-existing condition, those protocols are not equivalent, right? One is much better than the other. But applying that statistical lens, I mean, nobody had ever been able to look at it in that form. So there's sort of a thing in the large, all the way down to we saw things in the data where particular treatment, we realized, wow, this room for people who have that procedure their chances of readmittance are much, much higher. And it turns out that it had something to do with the ventilation system in the room. So fascinating things that you can lift up out of there, and a lot of efficiency for the healthcare.
Talking about those sort of odd little data things that you learn when you instrument the world and look at the data. I had an entrepreneur who's working on a stress watch that you wear, and it talks to your phone or your iPad and records that. And he's building stress maps of cities. But his target market is soldiers with veterans with PTSD. And he told the story of this guy who figured out, oh wow, it's Whole Foods that triggers my PTSD,
Interesting.
my attacks, and how odd is that? The guy but he was sort of like, he could see every time he went in there, his stress was elevated.
Yeah.
And who would know? Who would think that? And then of course, working with his therapist, he kind of got, it's these wide aisles, there's nowhere to hide,
Right.
And it was sort of like, sometimes you don't even know what you know until you actually instrument it. But I wanted to kind of think a little bit more about this healthcare space, because one of the things that it brings up, it's a little sideways, but it's easy to think about the data telling us what to do, and in some ways that's a wonderful trend where we're building these smart systems. But there's still a role for human judgment. And when you talk about healthcare, I'm thinking of this guy, Paul Levy, who used to run Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. And what's really interesting is he came in not from healthcare, and he said, wow, there's this central line, these central line infections, and we're killing people. He said, that's unacceptable. I want the rate to be zero. And they said, oh, no, it can't be zero. This normal is about, I don't know, whatever, 7 or 8%. And we're at 6%, so we're better. He said, I don't care. We're killing people. I want it to be zero. And it's sort of very Steve Jobsian, like, I don't give a damn, what you guys think is possible or not possible.
Right.
This is what it needs to be. And, with that intransigence, he actually got, to that level. And there's something about, this really interesting dynamic of, we can't just sort of give up to the data. We still have to, have values and goals. And how do you think about that?
That's a great question. So so part of my little secret is I have a degree in robotics, not computer science. So in the robotic curriculum I went through, we got some control theory, you got a little bit of hardware, a little bit of software, and a lot of, numerical analysis and whatnot. So I think about systems, right? And the ability to shift a system from one stable state to another. And that moving to zero, we've got the same thing sort of in our industry, if you will, these false failure rates. Tests that fail in the automated test run that are not really a failure, they're just flaky. The test fails on February 29th when it's leap year and whatnot. And you tell people it's got to be zero, and they say, no, okay. But you use the data to drive to zero, and as soon as you go from 2% down to 0.1%, you're in a different regime, a different stable spot. And people will never assume that life will be so much different there. And that's, you need someone crazy to sort of drive it to that, but the data can help you get there.
That's really true. It reminds me of that wonderful Bill James quote that was in Moneyball, where he said, there's people who above the curve and below the curve, but data moves the curve. And I think that's kind of a world that we're in, where we actually can change fundamentally what people expect.
Absolutely, and I'm in that world right now because we moved from building a shrink wrap product, SQL Server, you put it on the DVD, to running a continuous service, and the data is just flowing out of this. And so I've been spending a fair bit of time the last few months in R doing various sorts of exploratory visualization. And asking questions. Why do we have this spike right here only on this data center? People say, I don't know. But it spurs the right sort of questions, and it gives you this lens into behavior that you can't just explain it away anymore.
Well, that's the thing that's sort of interesting, that notion of exploratory visualization, which is really of having visualization be a tool that you use in development. And once you've figured it out, you actually change the service.
Absolutely.
As opposed to that you actually, I think about this in search engine, search quality teams. You use effectively visualization and testing and the like to actually figure out if the results are good, but you don't actually tweak the results manually. You change the algorithm until you get that yes, it's good.
So there's this big piece of this, which is I refer to as model generation.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's, different exploratory, visualization exploratory tools there. And then later on down the chain, sort of these explanatory sort of things.
So I want to talk a little bit about privacy.
Yes.
So tell me what you think about that.
You picked the topic on the highest on my what keeps me up at night list. Is that what it was? So,
yeah.
I think it's certainly a vexing problem, right? And I don't think that there's a tech solution to it, and it's some combination of policy. But I think of so many things today are sort of Wild West. I don't know what's being gleaned from me, and I don't know how it's being used, and it comes back in odd ways. I think a lot of it will get straightened out if we think about more things being a fair value exchange in the context of a trusted relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that squares away so much of it.
Yeah. Well, although I was talking with Helen Nissenbaum, who talks about a lot about that. She's from NYU, and she's done a lot of interesting thinking about contextual implied agreements.
Yep.
I gave you the data in this context,
right.
So that's the context you get to use it, and you can't use it in some wildly other context without my permission. And I think you can get a fair amount of distance with that. But it seems to me there's another class of data that I did not give to a provider at all. It simply observed.
Right.
And there it's I feel like we have these rules that are based on the notion that you can keep people from having data.
Yep.
And instead, we need to start having rules about, well, what can you do with it once you have it?
Right.
So like, you can't stop me from recognizing you.
Yep. Right.
And I don't think you're going to be able to stop me from, say, recognizing you with computer vision either.
Exactly.
But what you can do is saying, okay, because you can't use my face without my permission in these ways, and you can use it in these ways. And I think part of what we have to do is start thinking about, well, what are the harms that we're trying to prevent?
Exactly.
And then, you look at something like insider trading that works that way. You get people who say, actually, I don't want to know that because then I can't do something that I want to do. Yep. And actually, unfortunately, we have that around patents too, right?
Yes, exactly.
I don't want to know about prior art. But I bet there's some fresh ways to think about privacy in this world because there's just so much data and so much you can infer by overlapping data sets that it's going to be impossible to kind of do something like, oh yeah, you just can't know this.
Yeah, no, it's vexing in that some of it is counterintuitive. Some of the techniques that people can use to de-anonymize data. They're just, at first glance, wow, that's an interesting one. Yeah. And they're just out there.
Yeah, the notion that you can anonymize it, I think, will eventually just fall down.
Yeah, and so I think one element is who will serve as trusted aggregators? Yeah. And to your point, is how can it be used? And
so again, that gets us back to kind of the notion of an OS and somebody who basically says, okay, I'm going to centralize the risk.
Actually, we had something come up last week on this one. So for PII reasons, we can't know who has what database, if you will, in the SQL Azure service. But we can know that this particular database had a hiccup. And boy, it'd be nice to let the customer know, or they're heading towards a cliff or whatnot. And I said, well, can't we do this such that we're protected on both sides? Let us send a mail to the customer without any of the engineers ever knowing who that was. If somebody registered for that, there's a way that we can send a mail to them anonymously and say, hey, if you'd like to chat more, here's who to contact, back here. So the system needs to evolve to maintain these sorts of social constraints.
I want to ask you one last question before we take questions from the audience. When we were talking earlier, you started talking about your personal development practice and the fact that you're using your iPad as a second screen with ebooks, which I thought was kind of an interesting pattern. And actually, I wonder from the audience how many other people do that as well. By the way, I should mention, if you want to ask questions, use the hashtag StrataConf, and they're monitoring here.
Yeah, certainly of interest to you. I mean, it's my transition from being a guy in paper, to digital form. It's the fact that what I know, what I do can be available, whatever device. So the times when I frankly spend a fair bit of time writing code in hotel rooms at night, such the times I get to do it, and I wind up with my laptop and sort of iPad with a book in the other. So it's just in the ability to annotate and have those be synchronized, and it really has changed the experience. But,
all right. Do we have any audience questions, Kirk? What are ethical guidelines around the use of big data? I mean, I have opinions about it, and it kind of goes back to the golden rule. don't do something you wouldn't like somebody to do to you.
Right. Right. Right.
But yeah, I have to get very concrete about that in a business context.
Yeah, I think about it. Sometimes technology comes along and just sort of tips the contract. And look at the printing press, right?
Yeah.
In response, people could just slander. They could write something about somebody and just distribute it, to everyone. And sort of whether it's technology or policy that comes back to sort of restore the social contract, I think we're going to have both. So with respect to the ethics, a lot of challenges here. We were talking about healthcare earlier, and the concerns there, both in the small and in the large, are fairly significant.
Yeah, the thing I would just say in general, most people want to do the right thing. And then there's a set of bad actors who don't. And clearly you need regulatory systems of one kind or another, whether they're government regulatory systems or technical.
Right.
So you think about, for example, anti-spam. All kinds of bad actors who are trying to do things, or antivirus. Those are regulatory systems. And I was just reading a article about people now spamming Amazon ebooks with their direct publishing. You heard about that famous book, 35 Shades of Grey. That was apparently one. People are basically taking riffs off of a very popular best-selling title. I forget who, somebody has a Steve Jobs biography by somebody or other, Isaacson, and it's just like total scam stuff. You've got to be able to build, regulatory systems for the people who aren't going to perform according to the rules. But you also, I think, you have to not over-engineer ethics, because this is where people complain about government regulation. The assumption that everybody is a bad actor, and then we end up with way too many rules.
Right.
And I think it's also really important to let the system run for a while, so you actually figure out where the real problems are, and then you put in solutions, which have to be dynamic as well. That kind of leads me to this whole notion, and I've been playing with about sort of, regulatory systems that are focused on outcomes, not on the rules.
Exactly.
When we think about, search engine quality or anti-spam, we have a goal, but we're changing the
mechanisms
rules.
and remedy.
The mechanisms, versus you think about government regulation, somebody wrote down this rule in 1934, and we're still following it, and whether it works or not, it's on the books.
Right, so it's super important to specify the intent. Because how we get there will change.
And I think that's really where we need to start moving towards outcomes. And again, that kind of goes back to, I believe we're at the beginning of this whole new world of thinking about data and how we're going to actually build data services that work, that are dynamic, that are evolved, and this huge opportunity for really the equivalent of an operating system provider to tame that Wild West, make services accessible for developers in all kinds of different markets that just mean that everybody doesn't have to roll it from scratch.
Absolutely.
I give you the housing crisis of 2008 as example number one. Derivatives that nobody understood being used to fleece all kinds of people.
It gets back to this notion of being counterintuitive. I look at the Netflix challenge a few years back, and I think they did everything right. They tried to do open innovation. They tried to anonymize. And yet, and it wasn't in a malicious way, but several researchers were able to go and de-anonymize. So people can misuse this.
At the end of the day, though, I would put that in the category, was there really harm there?
No, exactly. That wasn't, but there's a potential, demonstrated potential for harm, right? And
but you contrast that with, kind of like what happened when Wall Street firms, basically, screwing the rest of us.
That's where the tech gets ahead of everything else.
Other misuse of big data, I think, to me, one of the biggest misuses of big data is not to use it. You look at our healthcare system with massive amounts of waste due to lack of coordination of care. The harm of not figuring out how to use the data effectively is far greater than the risks of, the more traditional worries about misuse.
Big data growing in other parts of the world in similar pace. I believe so. I'll tell you, one of the things I see is adoption, obviously, And you can see differences regionally just within the states. But I was over in Australia a couple of months ago doing a talk over there, and what I saw there is that in terms of understanding of the technology, you're a little bit behind, but in terms of its application, looking for real applications, I thought they were fairly advanced. I think the opportunity is global.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just see the adoption is where it's going to take off everywhere.
Well, I mean, I think the whole lean startup movement is kind of the Bible. Eric Ries's book and the like are really that's what it's about.
Yes.
The startup as a machine for learning, and that's all about data. And so that's kind of interesting, of course. You don't think of that necessarily as being, quote, big data.
Right.
And while big data is kind of a useful term, it's really, data in all its forms.
Exactly.
Small data. It's just really data intelligence.
Yep.
How do you build smart learning apps that close the loop?
Yeah, one of the things in this team I was working with last year is to figure out how do we maximize the our iterations, learning iterations, and what are we going to try to learn? Yeah. What data are we trying to collect? What hypothesis? So it's funny because we were going through sort of kind of inventing a bunch of this stuff, and then I read Eric's book, and I'm like, this is it right here. I don't need to, So I very much agree with that.
Yeah. And I think the whole Lean series that Eric's been working on with O'Reilly really is trying to map that process out into different areas of business.
Yep. Obviously, in the web space, so they are sort of the leading edge. But one of the things I see, financial services.
Yeah, obviously, financial is actually, I would say financial is ahead of the web. They've actually been doing it longer.
Yeah.
And the notion of the quant driving the business has been, hedge funds, all that.
Digital commerce, another one that's going along. A lot of natural resource planning and whatnot. If you look at the seismic work that's being done, and what I think is interesting there is you look at the oil and gas guys. They've got these big seismic models they made for a long time, and how do they derive new value from that? So a lot of industries it's really taking off.
And it's starting to take off in just industrial world in general. I think obviously supply chain.
Yep.
I think is you look at a company. I wrote a blog post a few years ago about why you should think of Walmart as a Web 2.0 company. Yep. Because everybody was still at that point thinking, oh, Web 2.0, that's Ajax apps.
Yep.
It's like no, it's about infusing an organization with data.
Yep. Yep.
And is there anything you want to just highlight before we wrap?
The other thing I would say is, I've been in the data space for 25 years, and there are two things. There's this whole ambient data, and then this machine learning statistical approach, which make this the most exciting time to be a data geek in my career. So, great opportunity for all of us.
All right. With that, thanks very much, and thanks for the work that you're doing. Where should people go to learn more about it?
They can just go look for the data market in Azure. They can start there and kind of spider from there. On the SQL Server website, there'll be some information there as well.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.